Good afternoon, everyone, from Dunrovin Ranch. It's a lovely, lovely sunny May afternoon, evening to be talking about birds, about the wonder of birds. And I am delighted to introduce you to the author of the book that we have been reading, The Wonder of Birds, Mr. Jim Robbins. Thank you so much for coming to Dunrovin.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, this has just been a delightful read. First of all, many of our members are gathered here around Dunrovin because of birds, primarily because of the osprey. Most people found us through the osprey web camera, but our interest in birds goes well beyond the ospreys. And I don't know if you knew, but during the winter, if you look up at the osprey's nest, you'll see that we have a perch for the ospreys. And during the winter, we hang bird feeders up there.
Nice.
And it's very nice. Lots of different small birds come. And then, of course, the sign goes out to the big birds that there are small birds gathered over here. And we've had hawks and falcons of all kinds stopping by to see if they can't grab a meal as well.
We had a tanager at our bird feeder yesterday. I love tanagers. They're western tanagers. They're so colorful, almost like a parrot.
They really are. We don't get them much here. They're more of a forest bird, more of a pine forest bird.
Yeah, that's where we are in the pine forest.
But I see them in the area around us, but not on the ranch. We haven't had one on the ranch. Yeah. Well, this has just been a delightful book. In many ways, it has delighted me because it goes well beyond the science of birds. It really it incorporates many of the scientific aspects and discoveries of birds, but also integrated the mythology and their place in human history and their role in the environment and what they can teach us about ourselves and about the environment. And so I think it was a very wonderful compilation about birds from a variety of sources. And I'm going to start with one of my questions. I also wanted to introduce everybody, first of all, to Diane Hoffman, who is on the telephone. Can you say hello, Diane?
Hello, Diane.
Hello, Diane. Everyone knows Diane from the chat. She now lives in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and she's been watching a number of wonderful birds in her area and has taken, since I've known you, Diane, I know of at least 2 extensive bird watching trips to Patagonia and to the Philippines. So,
that's true.
Yeah, this is a bird aficionado you have here online with us. But I am going to start with the cover leaf of this book. This is the hardbound copy of it. And I'm going to read what they say about Jim's book, and I want him to comment on it because I think it is intriguing, and I would like to say, I'd like to have you just elaborate. Birds, Jim Robbins posits, are our most vital connection to nature. That's a big statement. Our most vital connection to nature. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, first off, they're everywhere. I mean, in New York City, there are pigeons, there are sparrows, chickadees, and they are also charismatic in ways that other animals aren't. They fly, for one thing, and I think flight is has a very fundamental appeal to human beings. It kind of gives us a sense of transcendence, and I think that in the concrete canyons of New York, to watch a flock of pigeons take flight is that vital connection at work. There are papers I've read, and scientists believe that pigeons are more important than any other bird in a sense because they live in the urban areas of the world, and they are the last connection for a lot of people to nature. And it may be that we'll decide as urban beings to protect nature because the pigeons are still there and because they provide a sense of transcendence and a sense of what it's like to feel nature, because it's a powerful feeling to be next to a bird when it takes off, or many birds, and I think that there could be something to that. We've cut ourselves off from nature, but the birds still live amongst us, even in places like that, and they are still very charismatic, more because of their colors, because of their song, more charismatic and have more appeal than I think almost any other species of wildlife, or any other type of wildlife.
Yeah, they certainly are ubiquitous worldwide and cover such a huge variety of ecosystems.
Right.
Every ecosystem has its bird that has been able to make a home there.
Right. Adapt to that place.
Adapt to that place, yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with that. And I also agree that you have to care about something to conserve something. And if you don't have a personal connection to it, and I think that's part of what's in your statement, is the fact that they are accessible means that people care about them and see them as part of their daily life.
Yeah, for example, my mother lives in upstate New York, Niagara Falls, where I grew up, and there isn't any wildlife there. Maybe a squirrel once in a while. But a couple of years ago, a robin built a nest on the windowsill outside of her bedroom window. She could watch the bird laying the eggs, see the eggs, watch the babies hatch. I mean, it's a very powerful thing. And because birds are mobile and they can live almost anywhere, we still have our strongest connection in a lot of places is through birds to nature.
Yeah, I certainly would agree. One of the things that, of course, we're focused on are web cameras in birds, and they don't feature in your book much. And I don't think I saw them mentioned at all. Am I wrong?
Web cameras?
Yeah.
I think that I mentioned it in the chapter on Washington, D.C. and how they have webcams attached to the bald eagle nests.
Oh, yes, yes.
Where overlooking the police academy and
right.
another nest site. But no, not a lot. It's about more direct experience with
right.
birds.
But I'd like to have you contemplate that for a moment. That the web camera experience with birds. I mean, that's certainly one that we have a lot of experience with a particular web camera. But both from a scientific and a personal sense of birds, what role do you see web cameras having, or what possibilities do you see for webcams in the bird world?
Well, and perhaps it's something along the lines of our relationship to birds as pigeons. People in urban areas, people in out of the way places can still see birds do things they could never see otherwise. They can see young in the nest. I know that the bald eagles that were reintroduced along the Anacostia near Washington, D.C., there was a huge fascination people had with watching these eagles be born and be fed. And so it's a glimpse into natural history that a lot of people, perhaps few people, would ever be able to see if it weren't for a web camera trained on a nest.
Yeah, in fact, I would add to that, several years ago, I did a survey. We've had up to 800,000 people watching during the summer. A lot of people from a lot of different places. And I did a survey and asked them questions about their relationship to birds and to conservation and not just what they thought, but if they'd actually taken action. If as a result of having watched web cameras, had they, donated to an organization or looked up more information on the web. And it was astonishing the high degree to which web cameras were able to bring bird life into them and to make them really care about the birds. I mean, I think that my members here would attest to the degree of connection that is formed from the web cameras.
Well, that's great. I've done stories on the use of cameras these days in wildlife research, but not too much on webcams and with birds. Of course,
Suzanne?
Yes.
Can I a lot of us are on this particular camera because we met at other cams and we sort of hang together. So we'll do owls during January, and we'll do the osprey when they arrive here, and the herons in the spring. And we haven't necessarily, I wouldn't say I am a knowledgeable birder, but there are 3 or 4 birds that I have a very great depth of experience with. The cams have been able to show us a lot of things from mating all the way through to migration, things we would never ever have seen from the ground as birders.
Yeah, I think that, and I've been in conversations with Eric Green at the
Mm-hmm.
university about what are the web cameras teaching us that scientists did not already know. And I think that one of the greatest aspects is the amount of variation within a species in terms of their behavior and even their biology, because the web cameras have allowed us an intimate view in the lives of a selected few birds. Great.
Well, if I got a nickel for every time as a moderator I had to say, well, the literature suggests that this is what we're seeing, but it's not what we're seeing. We're seeing something that really contradicts the literature.
Yes.
Well, one thing I would have to say, both in my tree book, The Man Who Planted Trees, in this book, and other research I've done, is how little we really know about what's going on out there.
Exactly.
It's amazing, and that's kind of one of the things I try to get at in this book is we really, I keep saying to myself, we don't have a clue, and it's true in a lot of ways, and about a lot of things we don't have a clue.
It's actually humbling.
Pardon?
It's pretty humbling, actually.
It should be humbling, and it should teach us. My message is it should teach us that we shouldn't destroy the place before we figure out what it's all about. I have a feeling we're going to be surprised when we do.
And I don't think we'll ever figure it out. So we should never destroy it, right?
Right, but we can certainly figure out a lot more if we ask the right questions.
If we ask the right questions, there you go. All right. People would like to know how you got involved in this topic to begin with. You are a journalist, and birding didn't seem to come through as something that was a lifelong passion for you, and yet somehow you really devoted a great deal of research to the topic, and in such a large variety of ways. Like I said at the onset, from the mythology to the science to the implications. So, how did you unravel that knot, and what got you into it in the first place?
Well, I'm a science writer for the New York Times, and I have been since 1980. So I've been doing this a long time, and I am very interested, especially in systems, ecosystems, and their health, and how important they are, and how little we know about them. And so birds are an indicator for the health of an ecosystem. That's part of it. Part of it is they're just so damn interesting. Not as a birder. I mean, I do watch birds, and I know something about their history and their life history, but I'm more interested in them as part of a bigger picture of ecosystem health and well-being, and also just their transcendent value. I mean, I really do think in the right frame of mind, if you watch a bird take off, you can almost feel it. It's a powerful thing, and that's kind of what I'm getting at also with what I do is what is our frame of mind, what is our perception of the world, and what do we know about that, and what do birds tell us about perception? That's a big part toward the end of the book of what I do. But I did a story at the University of Montana on professors there, Ken Dial and Brett Tobolsky, who capture hummingbirds and other birds and put them in wind tunnels and X-ray machines and subject them to laser light to understand and unpack the minute physiology, the physiological aspects of a bird, how they fly, how they climb, all the things that birds do, known and unknown to the greater public. And that really fascinated me when I wrote that story about 6 or 7 years ago, and that led to this book. I didn't realize that there was this whole industry of research about birds, and I started to peel away the layers and found that it was very, very interesting. And so I looked at all the things people have done as far as research into the human brain, into human speech, human physiology based on birds. I talk a little bit about that around the penguin, the emperor penguins. And there's just a whole range of things people are looking at to understand more about humans based on birds, and I found that to be fascinating.
So how long did it take you to research research this book, and where all did it take you?
It took about 4 years, and I did other things in between, but most of it was in the United States. Washington, D.C. and the inner city.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very important chapter to me. I felt that it really shows the power of birds all around the western United States, less in the east, but into a lot of laboratories. That was really interesting to me, to go to these places where people are studying these different aspects of birds and try and provide a big picture of what they're doing with birds.
Earlier in our conversations with the school children, I thought that the conversation that we had about birds being the link directly back to dinosaurs was of particular interest, and what recent studies have shown in terms of the evolutionary gap about the wing and its use. And this is a new audience. Would you mind explaining, I mean, that when you talk about they are our living dinosaurs, how birds have really helped us look backwards in terms of understanding the whole evolution of dinosaurs better?
Well, I call this book an interpretation of birds. And I think that's what a lot of the theme that runs through the book is: how do people interpret birds to tell them something about the world? And the first chapter is about how Ken Dial at the University of Montana has looked at birds to tell us something about dinosaurs, because birds are the dinosaurs that made it.
Yeah.
120 or 30 million years of evolution, dinosaurs are gone, mostly, but birds have survived, and they're very old, and they've adapted. So he figured out a way to look at birds to tell us how flight first evolved. And up until he came along, flight had been there were two camps, and they're all based on fossils, looking at fossils. And one camp was the arboreal camp, and it was that birds climbed trees and then glided out of trees. And the other camp was that birds were running along the ground, and they saw an insect. It's called the cursorial camp, and they saw an insect, and they leapt up to grab that bird, or grab that insect, and they flew. The first flight occurred, and then they got better and better because they catch insects. But the question was, well, why would they have wings in the first place? And Ken's work is based on living birds. You know, he studies the physiology of birds in depth. So his point was, let's look at their physiology now, because they are dinosaurs. And he studied, in this regard, he studied chucker partridges, which are wild and still have a feral quality, yet you can still handle them. And he wanted that feral quality. Put them in the lab, and he put them with some hay bales, and right away they started climbing. They're ground nesters. They're precocial. They develop quickly. They don't have to be cared for very long by their parents, if at all. And they started climbing and running up inclines, up the hay bales and boards and so on. And he found, what he saw is that when they first started running, they were using a half a wing to balance themselves, to keep themselves low to the ground in balance, and that helped them evade predators. So birds that had these half wings were very able to get away from predators. That's his surmise. And as their wing developed, they started gliding off the top of these bales he had in his laboratory, and they could glide to the ground and do quite well. And of course, then after that, they started flapping their wings to escape and to move around. And he believes that is what happened to the dinosaurs many millions of years ago, that the first birds had half wings. They weren't wings, they were a stabilizer. They were how you escape predators. And as those birds developed and became better at gliding with those half wings, they could escape predators better. And so evolution selected them. And the ones with the bigger wings, the bigger half wings, survived. And so they became eventually full, through the course of evolution, became full wings, and those birds could then fly. And it's a very novel answer to the question of how birds fly, how they evolved. And there's a lot to it. I think he's added a lot to the debate about flight.
Suzanne?
Yes.
In that case, then, you're saying that the evolution, the half wings were really due to the very powerful talons that the birds had, since they could then climb without being able to fly as soon as they were, they were precocial.
Right.
Right.
That's actually one of Ken's points. He described to me a bird's feet as like a Leatherman. He said, the world is divided into three types of walking. Humans one type, and horses another, and then a third type. But he said birds do all of those. And the feet are like a Leatherman. They can make it do whatever they want. And they can go up the side of a building. They can go under an eave and up a log, up the side of a tree. And he's got films. I sat in his office with him and watched these films of birds doing all these behaviors. And I don't think people had, he said they didn't, and I think it's true, that people hadn't appreciated the climbing abilities of a bird. It's amazing. And he has videos to prove it, which is what he does. He takes videos, high-speed videos of birds for a whole range of behaviors, and then watches them and can look at the physiological behaviors to understand more about their locomotion.
I luckily saw some of those myself. There was a presidential series of lectures on birds here.
Mm-hmm.
I went to all of those, and he was one of the lecturers.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, very good. One of the things that I'm struck by we started off by saying that much of what we know about birds now is new. And one of the things that I liked about reading this book is that it wasn't written by a scientist who could not only evaluate the who could bring together the information on birds, but also bring together some of the information on the reluctance of scientists to accept new theories. And I'm wondering, I haven't talked to Ken Dial about the acceptance of his hypothesis or his theory of the wing being an intermediary climbing appendage that evolved then into a wing. How receptive has the science world been to that? I really don't know the answer to that, or do you?
I don't, but I agree with you about science. And there's I think it was Einstein who said science progresses one funeral at a time. I think there's truth to that. I don't know. I think I've seen articles on it in a number of places in popular literature, so I know it's been widely accepted. But there's a whole not invented here syndrome, and they'll find ways to shoot it down if it doesn't fit with the current. But I haven't followed the kind of the scientific culture around his idea, except that I do know some people think it's very interesting and could be right on.
The reason I bring that up is in another part of your book, you talk about neurogenesis, which is the creation of new neurons. And the scientist who first suggested that was blocked by other prominent scientists, which I thought was a very interesting thing to talk about. That science does kind of go in these leaps, and it's difficult to break into accepted theology, but not theology, but accepted scientific findings. Orthodoxy. Thank you. That's the right word. But I would like to go to that section about bird brains. And how recent those studies are. We're talking within the last decade, are we not?
No, I think it's longer than that, but not much. I think it was in the 80s he did his work. Fernando Nottebohm. He's retired now.
Yeah.
But he still comes into the office. He's writing a book. So.
Yeah. So if you all remember that section of the book, he was wondering about canaries that needed to relearn or learn a new song every year. Is that not right?
That's right, because birds have to fly. They are masters of things like adding to their physical weight when it's time to migrate. Or one of the things they do is they shed neurons after the mating season's over, and then they regrow them for the next mating season, so they can make more room in their tiny little skull for other things. And so it's a very interesting adaptation. And so he injected them with dye and found that these were regrowing, that new cells were appearing. And for a long time, people just refused to acknowledge that he'd done this research. It was published. I think there was some replication, but there was one fellow who I can't remember his name, but he was doing work with chimpanzees, And he absolutely bitterly opposed it because his research showed it wasn't true. And he said, he's made this famous statement, read my lips, no new neurons. Brains do not create new neurons. And of course, now we know that all brains create new neurons throughout the lifetime of the animal, including humans. Yeah. And it's one of those discoveries that's changed how we see the world, and it may also lead to ways to treat diseases from Parkinson's to depression and so on by, through a drug that would help create the right neurons in the right place. And so it was a revolution, and now it's well accepted.
I think it was also of interest to me in reading the book, the difference between wild and domesticated, and the number of neurons, the size of the hippocampi, that
right.
that you can see the increased learning physically.
Right.
In
Use
terms
it
of
or
the
lose
size.
it. Mm-hmm.
Right. Use it or lose it.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And it makes me wonder about my horses and making sure that they have plenty of mental stimulation so that,
It's true.
I think it's, yeah.
One of the wolf researchers I've interviewed referred to dogs as brain dead wolves. And wolves that are wild out there on the edge of survival every day develop a more robust neural pile in the brain because they're out there having to make all these life and death decisions all the time. And it's a very different environment than, a dog that lives around us and it's fed and taken care of and doesn't have to worry about predators and so on.
Right. Such as little Cola, who seems to want to come up here and say hello about now.
Yeah. You heard us talking about wolves and dogs.
Yeah, he's right here. Not a problem.
On cue.
On cue. There you go. Okay. Talking about wolves, there is a story in your book about, I believe it's ravens and wolves in Yellowstone. Since you brought Yellowstone wolves up, which I thought particularly fascinating. Again, to remind readers, can you kind of pencil in the details? And how did they figure this out? Did they do recapture on some of the ravens to know that at each kill these were the ravens that were following this particular pack of wolves?
I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but ravens are known as wolf birds because they live in proximity to wolves, amongst the wolves,
right.
Because they eat meat,
right.
And they get in for a wolf kill. Now, I don't know of any particular pack that was studied, but the literature that I've read and the theory, I talked to Bernd Heinrich, who's kind of the leader on this idea, is that they live in a socially complex environment. And I think ravens have the largest brain size to body size of any bird. And I think it's because they have to function amongst wolves. They have to know which ones they can trust, which ones they can't, who's going to kill them, who's not, how to get out of their way, how to jockey, how to pay attention, how to do all of these things and still get a meal. And then they have to do the same thing with their brethren, the ravens. They have to know how to hide their food, where to hide it, who's watching them, who's not. So this kind of social complexity leads to a development of a large number of areas of the brain in order to make this all possible. And of course, those birds that survive are best at it, and they pass those genes on to other generations of ravens. And so this social complexity hypothesis is a big thing when it comes to ravens and development of their nervous system.
And that would also spill over to the fission-fusion aspect
right.
of their makeup,
right.
Where they make different groupings for different reasons.
That's right. That they spend the morning with the ravens they roost with, and they go off with another group and spend some time, and then they're alone, and then there's another group. And that idea, humans do this as well, of who's important for your advancement, who's not, who you might be attracted to or not. All of those things, the fission is going away from the group, and the fusion is coming back and forming a connection. And so that constant renewal of social contacts is key to also the development of attention and memory and those key attributes of the brain.
I'm just looking at some of the questions here. Okay, we wanted to know, this is from our members, we wanted to know what your hopes are for this book. Who did you write it for, and what audience did you have in mind?
Well, my most important, my message or my mission, if you will, is to tell people this is an amazing planet that we live on. As a species, we've divorced ourselves from it, unfortunately. But I want people, one, to know that there are what we would consider miracles out there. All this neurogenesis is a miracle, really, if you think about it. And that we shouldn't take it for granted, and that we should stop destroying it and start backing away from the things that we do that disrupts habitat and start understanding and respecting the systems that sustain us. And I think that's key. And birds are a charismatic messenger about that. That's why I chose, one of the reasons I chose birds. These systems, and there's work out there, there's people out there these days who really feel that understanding and respecting these systems is key to survival on this planet. And I'll give you one example, the Amazon. Well, everyone, it's a beautiful place. Biodiversity is disappearing. We're cutting it down, and shipping out the logs legally and illegally, and all these things are happening. But one of the little known things that's happening, I actually wrote a piece in the Times about this, is that the Amazon is as big as the United States, the forest. And it's a driver of global climate systems. I mean, rain and no rain. I mean, a lot of that's driven by the Amazon, and that's rain and no rain in the United States. Drought could be caused by deforestation. And so we don't understand this. We don't, and we never will. We'll never be able to study that well enough to say, well, if we take this many trees, will affect the climate. So my feeling is we need to protect these systems that have evolved since the dinosaurs or before that, because we've adapted with them, and we need to understand how these systems work and appreciate them without having to necessarily pull them apart and understand them piece by piece, because that'll never happen. We need to believe in a bird because it's been here since the time of the dinosaurs or before that. And that should be wisdom enough for us, and it shouldn't necessarily have to be something we destroy before we realize what we've lost.
So your audience would be the general public. You are hoping that the book will spark that and turn itself into more of a personal caring about, and that then will turn into policy that affects these issues.
That's right. And part of what I try to do with the book that way is go beyond science. I think science is very conservative and narrow in a lot of ways. It chooses things it can study and can get funded, and they can collect data on. But there's a lot of things out there that you just can't study, or you don't ask the questions that are needed because you don't have the imagination to do that. And so things like one of the chapters is about ethno-ornithology and how indigenous people relate to birds. Well, there's a wealth of information that is totally unlike our science out there about birds. They have their own science about birds, tell us about the weather and about emotional issues and on and on. I mean, the literature could fill a whole library and then some. And so I want people to realize how limited our science is. And it doesn't necessarily tell us enough about how important the world is.
Or even how limited our perspective is as being sort of at the top of a heap of animals, that we are the knowing species. And some of these other cultures felt more belonging to a larger group of species and acknowledging their wisdom as well as our own.
Right.
And if you bring that out in some of the traditions of the Haida and you know. And I certainly have experienced that in Native American traditions and in Alaska Natives as well. You know, we have a very concerned group on our website, people who are by and large interested in conserving the world. What would you have us do with your book? What would you? How can we help you? How could we address the problems and issues? How can we move it forward?
Well, they could give the book to people and talk about why it's important to them. I asked them to imagine a world without birds. I mean, it would be a very poor place. No bird song like we're hearing now, and you wouldn't see the flight.
Well, and in fact, the bird Silent Spring,
right.
I mean, the book Silent Spring was a very instrumental book in changing a nation's attitudes towards environmentalism.
Yeah, and I keep reading alarming articles about what's happening to birds. I think I read 8 and 10 species of shorebirds are in trouble and could be gone by 2050. I mean, you see a lot of those kind of studies. I follow this, and people need to wake up. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. People need to wake up to who we are. Who are we? That's a question we don't ask. We assume we know who we are as a species. Science knows who we are, but I don't think that's true. And I think we need to ask how other cultures who live and have adapted to nature. I talk in there about a woman who studied different indigenous people, and she says they have this ability to sense the world outside of their body, to sense the trees, to sense birds, how it feels, to move out beyond the skin, their own skin, and feel the world in a much more enhanced way. Well, and she's an anthropologist. She just studies this, and other people have made these observations. Well, why aren't we asking that question? If the world can be sensed in a very different way, and a much more holistically, but also more fundamentally, if we can feel nature, if we can
more
primally and more intimately.
Yeah.
I want to know. I think scientists should be asking that question. That's a fundamental question, and I think we should know that. And there's plenty of things to suggest that. So why aren't we asking that question? I think those are the kind of questions we could start thinking about.
Clearly, we have some people some animals chiming in. Cola, let's be quiet, okay?
Book club, Cola.
Good dog. Yeah. So, what surprised you the most in all of this research? I mean, you just have this book represents a huge accumulation of research on the topic. And what were your aha moments that you came on something and thought, wow, I had no idea?
Well, my aha moments with this book is how basic questions like the one I just told you aren't being asked. I mean, you think that, well, there's so many smart people out there. I mean, there probably isn't much in the way of room for new ideas and stuff, but it's not true. People have groupthink, and they think along the same lines. And me, I'm a simple journalist. I've talked to a lot of people. That's a strength, I think. The big picture, seeing the big picture all the time because of what I do is a strength. But there's like this thing I just mentioned about the nervous system. I've written several books about the human nervous system, by the way. Why don't we know this? Why don't we ask this question? Why aren't we developing ways to understand the world better through direct perception? And there's literature out there. There's direct perception is the thing. There's some great books and so on about all this, but I do think lately people are starting to think about these things and what might be blocking us from a direct perception of nature along the lines of these indigenous people who have a very different take on the world. I just read a paper about people who are looking at scientists who are looking at in the Arctic at people who have this spiritual relationship with whales and how they dream about whales and become whales and things like that. And I think those things are important.
For a long time, as coming from a science background myself, for a very, very long time, we were taught that field biology, observational biology, was to be discounted. That there was during the, and I kind of rose through that period where quantitative sciences really sort of took over and took away from that, in-depth observation about something that's very maybe small in terms of the portion of the population or in terms of its overview of an entire ecosystem. But, particularly living in Alaska, Native American, Alaska Native information was completely discounted as being non-scientific and therefore of no use. And hopefully we have gotten well beyond that.
Well, I wouldn't say well beyond, but we're moving beyond that. I just wrote a piece about something called traditional ecological knowledge and how scientists are coming to understand, as in Australia, where they've adapted. They've had horrific fires and wildfires in Australia. They had one Saturday they called Black Saturday, and something like 400 people died, and 170 people, 400 people were injured. And what they're doing in places now, they realize that the Aborigines had used fire as a tool, and they would use it, burn in the cool season, and they would go around. They would stimulate production of game birds. They by burning off certain vegetation and allowing others to grow. And there's a whole science, indigenous science, around the use of fire there. And now they're starting to come back to that. They're studying it, and they're realizing, oh, there was a managed estate here. That's what they call it in Australia, an estate, but it was a giant. And I think that's the name of a book about how the Aborigines managed Australia, and they called it a giant estate that was well managed. And we're finally starting to appreciate that. And it's the same with the United States. We just haven't appreciated it yet.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that point. I think that there's also been a big divide between, scientific, factual investigations and sentimentality, spiritual connections. That as scientists are taught to be detached observers, and that becoming emotionally involved with your subject it will taint your science.
Right.
And in some ways, I think that actually withdraws some of that learning experience. If you truncate what you as a human naturally are doing, which is becoming attached to, just like I'm attached to Harriet. I'm unabashed in saying it. That doesn't mean I can't, objectively evaluate what's happening. And I hope we're moving beyond that as well.
I think we are. And I quote Carl Jung in the book there, who says that the Europeans, white civilization, has lost that emotional connection with nature.
Yeah.
And there's a huge reservoir of energy out there that I think other people knew how to tap into, especially with birds. And I think we need to relearn that.
Yeah.
I have a question from a chatterer.
Yes.
A chatterer. One of our attendees wondered if Mr. Robbins had any interest or had been involved at all in looking at the boreal forest of Canada, which does support most of the North American bird species for nesting or migration stopover habitats. And it's such a large area and such an important area. Had he ever looked at that?
I actually have written at least one article about the boreal forest and how climate change is changing it and killing trees. And
yes.
I wrote a book. I wrote a number of stories and then a book called The Man Who Planted Trees, and it was about how trees are dying. And I live in Helena, Montana, and virtually all 15 acres of our ponderosa pines died. We had to have them cut down, and what I found is that's happening in a lot of places, all over Montana, all over the western United States. It's in the U.S. it's kind of subsided somewhat, but it's happening all over the world, and it's astounding. And the boreal forest is one of those places where in fact the Arctic is warming almost twice as fast as the rest of North America, and so the boreal forest is really getting hard hit by climate change, and there's a lot of damage being done to forests there.
Um, one of the questions we had was, did you have a favorite chapter? They're all so different. Did one of these topics really engage you more than the other?
It's the chapter in Washington D.C. with the
Drug kids.
the drug, yeah.
Yeah.
It was astounding. I mean, I dropped into a world there that was totally alien to Montana.
Right.
You know, people who had grown up during the crack era, whose parents and friends were routinely stabbed and killed, and
Right.
I mean, beyond belief. And
Right.
and they had found birds of prey. And I quote one guy in there who talks about his father was murdered and beat him, all these different things. And his thing is flying birds. He says he goes out every day and he flies birds. The only way he can find peace is to fly his birds. And there's a number of groups of people, pigeon racers in the inner city of Los Angeles and other places who really find in birds, who are totally, have been through trauma of all kinds. So you can not imagine unless you live in places like that. And have found release and relief in birds and other animals, but particularly birds. And I try to get at why in there.
Yeah.
I think, there's a paper, but written by an ornithologist, which I thought was totally crazy, but interesting. And she wrote about how, about the fear of death and how we all carry it. And how birds are one of those things that give us a kind of transcendence and release from that fear and that anxiety. And it's been studied and it's shown that birds are a symbolic immortality for us.
Yeah. It does seem like it's something otherworldly living in our world that we can't quite touch and grasp, but we can almost envy or, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a program at Montana Wild that does that. I assume you know about that.
I don't.
Yes, for Native Americans. When they, Montana Wild rehabilitates eagles and some birds of prey right there in Helena. And they have partnered with the VA hospital right there in Helena. And so, we have a large number of VA veterans are Native American in Montana. Proportionally compared to other states, it's a more significant population. So, and it's really had an impact on the wildlife biologists. This particular program. I mean, I think that the impact in terms of its spiritual connection has gone both ways, because many of the biologists have been taught to not see that part. You know what I mean? They've been a little bit disconnected from that. The scientists, yeah, or managers, and we were taught not to think of the individual animal, but of the population. Yeah. So
we have a lot to learn.
We do have a lot to learn.
Again, one of the messages of the book is how humble we should be and how much we have to learn.
Yeah.
Keep an open mind. That's my motto. Keep an open mind.
Yeah. Well, it is a provocative book. I mean, there are little nuggets in there strewn throughout in my mind that show us how we've gone wrong in some of our bird brains, for example. That they aren't constructed like human brains, and so therefore they're lesser rather than more.
Right, and now we realize they're bird brains.
That's right. They're more, not less.
They've banished the term bird brain.
Yeah.
Because, and what they did is how they banished the term is they renamed the parts of the brain of the bird brain.
I thought that very interesting that they convened scientists to rename. Right. And I also loved, and I don't know whether this was your use of the terms or whether you got it from one of the people the scientist who was studying it, but comparing our brains to layered cake versus fruit cake. And that was a very vivid visual image of how they differ.
And what happened was, I think 100 years ago, a scientist whose name I don't remember looked at a bird brain and said, all the mammal brains look the same. They're layered. Right. Layer cake, right. Of a dolphin or chimpanzee or whatever. And they have a cortex on top, which is where all the thoughts take place, and analytical thought and so on. And then the emotional part of the brain, the midbrain, and the reptilian part of the brain beneath that. Well, they opened up bird brains and they said, Jesus, it's a jumble. They're nothing like us. They're not as smart as us. And that lasted for 100 years. People assumed that birds weren't that smart.
Yeah.
And scientists started asking questions about the birds and saying, well, maybe they're just different. And that opened up a whole new era in terms of assessing bird intelligence that led to this consortium of scientists who got together at a meeting, official meeting of brain scientists, and then they renamed all the parts of the brain to reflect new knowledge.
And I thought it very interesting that IQ tests were given to birds, IQ tests that were also given to humans, that required no language, required no prior knowledge, and that the birds did better in many ways in instances.
Right. And also, what do birds know? I mean, okay, they have the IQ of a 7-year-old. Some birds do, they say, but the question that has never been asked is, what do birds know that's different than us? Maybe they know more. Maybe this gets to the whole language of the birds that I talk about in there, how in times past people thought humans could understand bird language. And, you just don't know those things. And all I can say is keep an open mind.
Well, and as you said in our earlier session, I mean, the thought of a bird going 40 miles an hour and slowing down and landing on a twig that's moving is something beyond our capabilities, no matter how we think about it.
Right. And so all the study of flight and how powerful our flying machines and how capable they are. Ken Dial told me, he said, when you watch a bird land on a cattail, go from 40 to 0 in a couple of seconds. He said, that's flying. And
Hold on.
We have nothing that can do that. We have a lot to learn. What they've learned from birds about flying, by the way, is the next step in flying for humans, designing aircraft that morph, that change shape, going from a fixed wing aircraft to something where the wings are tucking it in,
like an osprey.
Right.
Yeah.
Things like that. So, and there are people working on that and some designs.
Fascinating. Do we have any more questions, Diane? Are you there, Diane? Uh-oh. I think we lost her. Jake, are we on? Okay. Well, it's.
I'm sorry, I had my mute on.
Okay.
I said we had a lot of chatter, but we don't have any questions, and a lot of it is just bringing up.
Well, you're cutting out, and I can't hear what you're saying.
Well, actually, that's because I stopped saying anything.
Okay. Well, Jim, this was such an interesting book to us. We would like to do the book again in greater depth this winter when we are not all out in our gardens and watching birds. But kind of taking each one of your 4 sections and looking at it in a little greater depth. And I hope I can lure you back.
Yeah, I think, it's not too far.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us in this great book, and you for coming and giving us, kind of the behind the scenes and sharing your wonder with us. It is a wonderful book, and I hope it accomplishes what you wanted to, and we will do our part.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, by all means.
So people say, well, what can we do?
Yes.
You asked, what can we do?
Yes, what can we do?
And there's a fellow in the book, he's an ethno-ornithologist, Andy Gosler. He's from the UK. He teaches at Cambridge. And he said, they get first-year biology students that can't name 2 birds. 20% or 30% of the students can't name 2 British birds. And Britain has this wonderful history of relationship and stories and culture about birds. And it's being lost, And so why would you save something that you didn't understand? And so he says, so you ask them these things and you tell them that this bird is disappearing, and they say, well, why should I care? I didn't know about that bird until you told me about it. He said, but when you take them out and you go bird banding and you put a bird in their hand and they hold it, he said it's a transformative experience. It changes everything. And I think that is the battle. That is where we need to break the barrier. We need to, get away from the screens and the computers and the phones and the video games and move out into nature or bring nature into the city and start to reconnect that way and other ways with life. And this is life, and it's a creation, and we need to understand that, feel that. And I think that's what people can do, is work to get people out in nature or bring nature
into them.
I envision forests in cities. I think that would be a great thing in unused areas where you have wildlife and connection to
Well, Central Park, there's a whole Central Park birding group. And it is a very big stopping point on migratory routes, because it is an island of forest in a concrete jungle.
Right.
Yeah, and even rooftop gardens. You know, it doesn't even mean that you have to take down the buildings. You just add the greenery.
And look at the High Line, what that has meant to people in New York.
Yeah.
People want greenery. People want nature. And
Yeah.
it's just imagine a way of finding innovative ways to get it into people, a delivery system for nature.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, you know, I heard you say get away from screens, and I don't disagree with you at all. But for those who can't, those who are homebound, I think the web cameras can play a really vital role in doing that.
Right. Yes, I agree. I mean, I'm not saying get away from screens completely, but just get an over-dependence on them.
I totally agree.
Right.
But I do think that these web cameras bring a unedited, real experience into the home, because it's not a BBC film that has a beginning and an end.
Right.
It's an ongoing, and nobody knows what's going to happen. It's real.
Yeah.
And I think that for those who are homebound, it can be that retouch.
Oh, definitely. If you're homebound, it's I mean, it's part of the wonder of birds, is watching them go through their life.
I think all of us were at one time or another introduced to nature and birds by our parents and what have you. So I think it's a wonderful suggestion. Get people involved in going out to natural parks just to take a look and take a walk, and then get them interested in the birds. I think that's such a great suggestion and important.
Yep. I agree.
And I see an effort to do this. There's outdoor schools getting started in places. There's you know, schools that take a Friday and then go into the woods and things like that. There's an upwelling of this kind going on. I think it's vital to encourage it.
That would be our donkey.
Well, the donkeys are acting up over there.
They think it's dinner time. And they're right. And with that, we will.
This is the Ranch Symphony.
Very much. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Jim, for being with us. We'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.